Good evening, everyone. We're delighted to welcome back to SAIS Europe, at least virtually, Professor Frank Fukuyama, who's the Oliver Nomellini Senior Fellow at Stanford University. As many of you know, Frank is the former Bernard Schwartz Professor of International Political Economy at SAIS and was head of the IDEV program, and would relatively frequently travel to Bologna once or twice a year to meet with our faculty and students. He was always very generous with his time. And indeed, in 2005, he was our keynote speaker for our 50th anniversary celebration, engaging in a truly memorable discussion on immigration and identity in Europe and the United States, a topic that obviously is still at least as relevant today. And he did this together with Giovanni Sartori, who passed away in 2017 and is widely regarded as one of the most prominent Italian political scientists. Anyway, Frank, we certainly miss your trips across the Atlantic, and I look forward to your lecture. So let me pass the floor over to Lorenzo.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you very much, Director Plummer. It is an honor for me to be here today. My name is Lorenzo Marchetti. I am the president of the Student Government Association here at SAIS Europe, and I am very honored to host tonight for this event Professor Francis Fukuyama. It is very weird to try to introduce a character such Professor Fukuyama, since he's probably one of the most well-known scholars in political science all over the world, but I will try to do so. A couple of words about this event. After the introduction I will promptly make. The professor will have a conversation with us of around 35-40 minutes. And after that, we will open for questions from the public. Please be aware that today's event is organized by the Student Government Association in partnership with the SAIS Europe. And therefore, we would like to give spot to the students to ask the question they would like to such an eminent guest. So without further ado, please let me introduce Francis Fukuyama, Professor Oliver Nomellini Senior Fellow at Stanford University's Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies, Morschbacher, Director of SIS Center on Democracy, Development, and Rule of Law, and Director of Stanford's Master in International Policy Program. He's also a Professor of Political Science. Professor Fukuyama is most known because in 1992 he wrote a game-changing book in political science and in the history of intellectual thinkers, The End of History and the Last Man, that has appeared in over 20 foreign editions. In his most recent book, Identity, the Demand for Dignity and the Politics of Resentment, he discussed the role of identity in current politics, and it was released in 2018. As Director Plummer previously said, Fukuyama is a good friend of SAIS Europe, and since he has been the director of the International Development Program from 2001 and 2010. And therefore, without further ado, I would like to have everyone joining me for a warm welcome to Professor Fukuyama. Thank you for being here with us, Professor. It's an honor.
Okay, thank you very much, Lorenzo, and thanks, Professor Plummer, for the invitation, as well as the Student Government Association for having me. I really miss SAIS. You know, I taught there for nearly a decade, and as Mike said, I used to travel out to Bologna every year to try to give a talk there. You know, I didn't do it for the students, I did it for the food, but I take it that no one's eating a lot in restaurants in Bologna quite yet. So the fact that this is virtual doesn't deprive me of all that much this year, but I do hope to be able to make it back at some point. So I thought I would talk about global politics in the wake of the COVID epidemic, and in particular, the role that information technology has played in shaping our politics. So let me just begin with some broad observations. This has not been a good period for liberal democracy around the world. Freedom House, on whose board I actually sit now, publishes its annual Freedom in the World survey. They just published the one for 2020 about a month ago. And it's very disturbing. It points to 15 continuous years of decline in aggregate democracy scores. And the decline was particularly sharp last year under the COVID epidemic, where many countries used the epidemic as an excuse to increase executive power and restrict democratic liberties. I think most notably in that report, two of the countries that suffered the biggest declines in their scores were the two largest democracies in the world, India and the United States. In fact, India fell into a partially free category because of the shift of the Modi administration to a new kind of national identity based on Hindu nationalism. And then, of course, in the United States, we saw a contested election, the first, contested peaceful transfer of power, which is something that we've been warning new democracies against, but yet we experienced that in Washington, DC this year. So it's it's overall a bad situation. There's obviously numerous sources for this. Part of it is coming from geopolitics, from the pressure from consolidated authoritarian regimes, China and Russia in particular, that are now quite willing to try to project their own models outwards and have the power and stability to do that. But in a way, the more insidious problem has been the rise of populism in established democracies, most notably in the United States. But virtually every democracy in the world has a populist movement. French presidential election, as I'm sure you're aware, could bring to power Marine Le Pen, which would be a sea change in European politics. And you've had within the European Union, Viktor Orban and Jarosław Kaczynski in Hungary and Poland, respectively, that have really shifted away from a liberal model towards what Orban has called illiberal democracy. So there's a lot of discussion. We've had 4 years of discussion as to why this has been happening. I think that, that discussion, that earlier discussion, really centered around two competing explanations. One was economic and one was largely cultural. The economic discussion had to do with globalization and the kind of inequality that globalization had produced. Lots of left behind, especially working class citizens in democratic countries that didn't feel that they were profiting from the overall growth in every country. You saw a rise of oligarchs in basically every country in the world, in Europe, in Asia, in many other places. I have a blog. I should advertise this. I have a blog called Frankly Fukuyama, which is on the website of a magazine I helped to found last year called American Purpose. And I actually have a post there in which I blame Silvio Berlusconi for the decline of Western civilization, because in many respects, Berlusconi was the first oligarch who figured out the relationship between media power and political power. He controlled a media empire, Mediaset, and he used that empire to get himself elected as prime minister of Italy. I think for Italy, this was a huge tragedy because right at the end of the Cold War, there was an opportunity to shift Italian politics out of the heavily clientelistic model that had prevailed through most of the post-war period into something much more modern. But instead, Berlusconi used his position to protect his own economic interests, and then used his economic interest, his media empire, to keep himself in power. And that's actually a pattern that has been replicated throughout, especially the former communist world, where many Eastern European countries have seen the rise of similar kinds of oligarchs who bought up media properties, legacy media properties, not because they were particularly profitable, but because they were avenues towards to power. So you have a country like Ukraine currently, where there's about 6 or 7 big oligarchs that really control most of the Ukrainian economy. They all own TV stations and newspapers and control discourse. And I think that's one of the Berlusconi legacies. In a way, Donald Trump is a bit like that, because he, like Berlusconi, understood that media power depended on celebrity and that he could leverage that. He didn't own a media empire, but he worked very closely, with Fox News to project an image of himself that, created a major populist base of power. So these are some of the things that have been going on in the economic sphere. What I argued in my book Identity, however, was that you can't understand the rise of populism simply in economic terms, because if that were the case, you would have expected to see the rise of the left everywhere. And in fact, the left has made a comeback, with the campaign of Bernie Sanders in the United States. But the dominant political forces that have actually succeeded in coming to power in most countries has been these right-wing nationalists. And I would include, by the way, not just countries like Hungary and Poland, but Narendra Modi in India, who has tried to replace a kind of liberal founding identity with one that is based on Hindu nationalism. It's true in Southeast Asia, where a kind of militant Buddhist nationalism has arisen in Sri Lanka and in Burma and many other places. So how do you explain the rise of the right-wing version of populism? And I think that really has to do with issues of identity. Because in fact, if you look in the United States at who voted for Donald Trump back in 2016 and in the most recent election, his base, although founded on working class, voters that had defected from the Democratic Party, was actually, had median incomes above the national average. And so you can't make the argument that this was simply the losers of globalization. There was something else going on, which really had to do with, I think, a certain kind of cultural identity. There's been a shift in the nature of politics globally from one that was defined by a spectrum that ran from left to right around economic ideology, with the right promoting free markets, property rights, individual, entrepreneurship, and the left wanting redistribution, social protections, greater welfare state, and so forth. And I think today that kind of politics, although it's still present, has been displaced in many places by one that is based on ideology. And you saw that very clearly in the case of Donald Trump, where he actually promised to keep, important parts of the welfare state, like Medicare and Social Security, but campaigned on the threat from foreigners. Anti-immigration has been an important component of that message. And that's true, I think, for the rise of populism in Europe, in Italy with Salvini, in the case of the AfD in Germany, all of the other populist parties really got their start with the migration crisis in 2014. So I think this has actually now become a fairly familiar story. The sociology of populism, I think, is actually quite interesting. I have a colleague at Stanford, Jonathan Rodden, who's, I think, written a very interesting book showing that the single biggest correlate for populism globally, or who votes for a populist party, is actually population density. That liberal voters tend to be located in big cities with lots of economic opportunity, a lot of diversity, and populist voters tend to live in second and third tier towns and villages in the countryside and the like. And that's true almost anywhere you look. It's true in the United States. It's true in Britain with the Brexit vote. It's true in Hungary, where, you know, in Budapest, Orban doesn't have actually a lot of supporters. His support base is outside of the big city. That's true of Erdogan in Turkey, where he also is not that popular in Istanbul and Ankara, but has a big support base among people living elsewhere. And I think this correlates with a cultural cleavage between these two population groups, where more rural voters tend to be more supportive of traditional values of religion, of patriotism, and the like, and that has driven a lot of the populist surge that we've seen. Okay, so that I think is fairly clear. So since I wrote my identity book in 2018, a lot has really changed even from that point, where I think that there's some other factors that are playing into it. The United States is different from Europe in the following sense, that a lot of our identity issues really have to do with race and racial identity. This is, I think, one of the long consequences of our racial history that is really not replicated in other democracies like Canada or Britain or other places. It really starts in the 1960s when the Democratic Party, which had been a coalition that included a lot of progressive intellectuals, working class Catholics, but also a lot of Southern segregationists, began to split apart because of the Democratic Party's embrace of the civil rights movement. And progressively, Southerners began leaving the Democratic Party and switching over to the Republican Party. This switch took an entire generation, but it meant that the two parties, which had been really separated by economic ideology, were now increasingly defined by racial identity. And you can see that, you know, in the current composition of the delegations, congressional delegations, where about 40% of Democratic senators and Congress people are, you know, women or minorities, compared to a Republican Party where the comparable number is only about 6%. And so this, you know, is a legacy that I think continues and has been one of the sources of polarization. I don't think, however, that it's fair to say that in the United States, this is simply all about race, which is, you know, one interpretation that's out there, because I do think it is the case that there are other sources of cultural resentment that, you know, that are in a way more legitimate about the way that, you know, culturally those better educated elites with better economic opportunities tend to look down on people who are not like them, even if they, you know, claim that they're, you know, that they're not particularly prejudiced in that fashion. And I think that was the kind of resentment that has driven a lot of people to vote Republican in the United States. In Europe, I think you have a very similar division, though not as explicitly based on race as in the United States. So, for example, the AfD in Germany is heavily based in Eastern Germany, former communist East Germany, because they have a very different history in which liberalism was not inculcated during the communist years, and in which culturally there has not been the kind of transformation that's taken part in the in the Western German states. But this brings me to the current situation in which I think information technology plays a much bigger role, because I think that the large internet platforms have actually promoted a kind of identity politics, both on the right and the left, that has increased the degree of polarization and is leading to, I think, what is a really major challenge for modern democracy, and in particular American democracy, where the different sides of the polarization don't just have different policy disagreements, they actually have different understandings of reality. Now, this was true for a long time in areas like climate change, where there is a lot of climate denialism that's been around in conservative circles for some time, but it's become a particular acute crisis in the United States ever since the November 3rd election last year, where poll data still shows that something like 70% of Republicans believe that Joe Biden did not get legitimately elected and was there only as a result of massive fraud on the part of the Democrats. And it's hard to imagine this sort of thing happening in a pre-internet age. If you wind the clock back to the 1960s, information was actually quite limited in its ability to spread. You had 3 over-the-air broadcast TV channels. You had a number of major newspapers that acted as gateways or guardians for the kind of information that people had. Today, that's completely different. People are simply deluged with information. Martin Gurry wrote a book back in 2014. He's a former CIA analyst that began writing about this in the wake of the Arab Spring, where all of a sudden people were dealing with the opposite problem of information overload. And this dovetails with what Jonathan Haidt calls motivated reasoning. We have a kind of standard model of rationality in which people believe there's an objective world outside of their minds, and they try to gather empirical information about that. They infer causal connections based on that empirical information, and they design policies that suit their preferences based on that kind of analysis. And I think that what Haidt points to, and a lot of other social psychologists, is that actually that's not the way the human mind works for many people. They start actually with preferences, and they use motivated reasoning. They use their considerable cognitive abilities to justify the preference outcomes that they like. And if you, for example, want to believe that Donald Trump won the November 3rd election, you go on the internet, you can find tens of thousands of sources that will confirm that belief. And that simply wouldn't have been possible 30, 40 years ago. And as a result, you have this really big challenge to democratic deliberation, where you get disagreement not just on policies, but on basic ways of seeing the world. I think that any liberal democracy depends on a common, factual basis of information, and then, proceeds in a deliberative fashion from there. But these days, given the degree of polarization, you don't even have that possibility. I think that the large internet platform, so there's been a lot of discussion of threats to freedom of speech, and I think they come from a number of sources. Obviously, authoritarian governments still are a major threat. China has embraced big data and artificial intelligence in a big way. It uses its masses of surveillance data over its citizens to support a social credit system that is able to monitor the individual behavior of more than 1 billion people in a very minute way, and use that to control people. The Russians have come up with a different method of weaponizing social media and the internet to undermine the belief in the legitimacy of the institutions of their big democratic rivals. So that's clearly one set of threats. The second threat, has to do with concentrated media power. This is the Berlusconi model that I mentioned earlier, which has really been an obstacle to the consolidation of democracy in many parts of Europe. But the final threat really does have to do with the way that the big internet platforms, and basically you're not talking about anything more than 3 companies, you're talking about Twitter, Facebook, and Google, the way that their business models have encouraged polarization and extremist views, because their business models have depended on virality and attention from users, and what gets attention is not a kind of objective recitation of facts. It's invective, it's uncivil behavior, conspiracy theories, and the like. And one of the big policy challenges now is how to restore something like a greater consensus around information. In this respect, there's been a big division between the United States and Europe. Europeans have always been much more comfortable with state regulation, and I think they've taken the lead in terms of trying to regulate the internet. They've got a serious set of privacy rules that were encoded in GDPR back in 2017. I think they actually could be stronger, but at least they're there, and there's really nothing comparable in the United States. You have some state level laws like in California that are similar to GDPR, but nothing along those lines. They've been much more active in antitrust than the United States. They've launched antitrust suits against the big platforms over the past decade and have been trying to enforce them much more vigorously, and they're much more willing to regulate directly. So you have, a recent set of proposals from the EU Commission on data regulation that tries to directly address the problem of disinformation, bad data, conspiracy theories, and the like. And on a member state level, you already have a lot of those kinds of regulations in effect, like the NetzDG law that the German government passed a couple of years ago. In the United States, this is one of the enduring features of American exceptionalism, that the United States is exceptional in the sense that we don't like state regulation, and we are much more distrustful of the state. In Europe, I think there's a tendency to believe that a lot of harms can come from private sector actors like big corporations, and you need the state to protect you against them. In the United States, we have the opposite view, that the only real threat to liberty comes from the government itself, and the private sector is a protection against an overarching government. And therefore, we have tended to regulate or turn to regulation less readily than in Europe. This has started to change. There's been an obvious sea change in the way that antitrust is regarded. It's very interesting, actually, when you compare the United States and Europe. Thomas Philippon, he's French, but teaches at NYU and wrote a book last year, a fascinating book about how the United States and Europe have basically flipped places over the last 20 years. That prices in Europe across the board during the 1990s tended to be lower in the United States than they were in Europe, and now across the board prices in Europe tend to be lower than those in the United States. That's for telecom services, pharmaceuticals, travel, a whole variety, a whole basket of consumer goods. And his argument is that that is because the European Commission and individual European governments have been much more willing to enforce competition policy than has the United States. There's a long history to this having to do with the rise of the Chicago School back in the 1980s and the shifting of American antitrust policy towards one that was largely either approving or complacent about the scale of large corporations. But like many policies, I think that got carried to extremes, and the United States has been paying the price for this. Let me conclude just by talking about some work that I've been doing personally in this area. In my institute, in the Freeman Spogli Institute at Stanford, we've established a cyber policy center, and I've been running a project on democracy and the internet, and I formed a study group last year. It started out as a study group on antitrust with regard to the large internet platforms, but we began to realize as we got into our discussions that antitrust was actually the wrong framing for the problem. It was a tool that could be used, but probably wouldn't be sufficient to get at the specific political harms that large platform scale produced. I think right now there are a number of harms that these large platforms potentially create economically. They can stifle competition. They can block small competitors from arising. This is the sort of thing that traditional antitrust law looks at, but there's a whole set of political harms that antitrust law is really not very good at addressing. And in particular, those have to do with the way that the platforms moderate content. They moderate content, they've been doing this for a long time in terms of filtering out pornography, violence, various forms of incitement and the like, but they've come under particular political pressure to reverse some of the trends of misinformation and conspiracy theories that have proliferated and contributed a lot, I think, to American polarization in the last election campaign. And this culminated after January 6th with Twitter's decision to deplatform Donald Trump. So this is actually quite a complicated issue. And I think that, in my view, I was quite happy to see him kicked off the platform. It's actually kind of a pleasure not to have to respond to his tweets on a day-to-day basis. But I think that it fundamentally poses a challenge to democratic practice when a private profit-making company has the power to silence a major political voice in the way that Twitter did. I think that these platforms have neither the capacity nor the legitimacy to be making decisions like this. And although they've tried to reverse their role in proliferating bad information, I think that in the long run, you cannot rely on a private sector actor to perform what is basically a public duty of supporting a certain kind of democratic political order. And therefore you need a different kind of solution. And that solution, that we recommended was what we called middleware, was basically the outsourcing of content moderation to a competitive layer of companies that would stand between users and the big platforms to try to allow users to have greater choice over what they saw in their internet feeds. I'll just conclude by giving you a little anecdote. I, like everybody else, do a lot of shopping on Amazon. And I noticed in the past few days, they give you recommendations for books to buy down at the bottom of your shopping page. And my recommendations, the top like 6 or 7 of them were Rush Limbaugh, Jeanine Pirro, Devin Nunes, Donald Trump Jr., Lou Dobbs. And it struck me as completely bizarre. Like, I cannot imagine how they got from my browsing history, how the AI got from my browsing history to this particular list of recommendations. But it does point to this, big problem with these platforms, which has to do with the fact that the algorithms that determine what you see when you go to them are completely non-transparent. You have no idea why they're recommending what they recommend to you. And I think what we need is actually some way to make them more transparent and to give control back to the people that actually use them. So I've gone from kind of broad overview of global politics to a very specific dive into policy. So at that point, let me stop and open this up for broader discussion.
Thank you, Professor. Your words were very much appreciated by the student community and also all the people who are connected through the internet. Let me remind everyone that if you would like to ask a question to Professor Fukuyama, you could use the question and answer inbox. As I said before, I will read the question, and also I will try to give precedence to the students, since this is a SGA sponsored event. That said, Professor, I would like to ask you a question to start our conversation. So you discussed from global politics to the information revolution we are living through and the new dynamics that come from it. How did COVID impact the dynamics you have been describing? Did COVID?
Oh, yeah. I'm sorry. Yeah, that's right. The post-COVID world was part of the lecture title, and I didn't really talk about that. Well, COVID, I think, as was made clear in the Freedom of the World report, had a bad effect on democracy in general, because there are many countries, El Salvador, Uganda, Hungary, Philippines, and so forth, that used the pandemic as an excuse to increase executive power and take it away from legislatures, to close down journalists, to prevent bad news from getting out. And that's been a practice, unfortunately, was going on here, meaning in the United States as well. What the long-term impact of this is going to be, however, I think is actually quite complicated, because the world is going to come out of the epidemic sooner or later. I think many leaders that claim these executive powers are not going to want to give them back. They're going to try to hold on to them for as long as possible. But once people can, return to being out in the streets in big crowds, demonstrating, putting pressure on politicians, it's possible that you'll see a shift in the relative balance of forces. And like all natural disasters and emergencies, COVID has revealed a lot of inequalities in the way that people were infected, the way that governments failed to protect a lot of people. The vaccine distribution has become another sore point in terms of government failures. And so I think that it's possible that there will be a different kind of political dynamic. On the other hand, the shift to everything being done online, as we're doing now, has also simply increased the size and the importance of these big internet platforms. you know, it's actually hard to see how any of us would have gotten through this pandemic without them. And so it, you know, does appear that they are going to be kind of inevitable components of our life. But I think it's also focused more political attention on, you know, the way that governments regulate and seek to control them. And so that's an evolving story that I think will, you know, that where we haven't seen the end of the discussion yet. By the way, you know, one of the big intellectual challenges right now is to try to understand the cross-national variation in the way that different regimes and different governments handled the epidemic. I wrote an article about this in Foreign Affairs that came out last summer, in which I gave a, you know, preliminary accounting of this, that, you know, it had to do with state capacity and social trust and leadership and so forth. I think, frankly, that if I couldn't write that same article today, because we've seen a very puzzling set of national outcomes. So a country like Germany, which last summer looked like it was doing extremely well, is now doing, you know, very poorly. The United States, which last summer looked like it was doing very poorly, is now actually doing pretty well. We thought that India 3 months ago had largely escaped the crisis, but now it's, you know, it's the worst off of really any country in the world. One final observation, it does seem to me that populist leaders have a particularly bad record in dealing with COVID. And I would point to three in particular. So one is Trump, obviously. Another is Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil. And a third is a populist of the left, Andrés Manuel López Obrador in Mexico. All three of whom basically didn't take the disease seriously and therefore, you know, permitted their countries to suffer a huge amount of excessive deaths. And I do think that there is a connection between their populism and those outcomes, because populists want to be popular. You know, they don't want to tell their followers things that are, you know, impose costs or are stressful or unwanted. And therefore, it's probably not an accident that you had those outcomes. And, you know, that may affect the future of populism a little bit more broadly.
Thank you, Professor. I do agree with most of the points you made. So as I previously said, I would like to open the question to the public. The first one is Snea, who is a student here at SAIS Europe. And she is asking two questions. Do you see the rise of Biden and the shift toward democracy in the face of populism impacting India's right-wing Hindu nationalist agenda, losing traction with the less populist, more secular and liberal Indian National Congress? And the second one, no, well, let's go with the first one. The second one I will ask as a follow-up.
Okay, well, the direct effect of Biden on India, I think, is probably going to be pretty limited. You know, in general, what's happened in the United States with the 4 years of the Trump presidency, I think, has been a disaster for global democracy, because the United States projected an image of a successful democracy to the rest of the world. I think it's that soft power of the appeal of a liberal democratic order in the United States and its ability to accommodate, you know, a very diverse population that was really the source of strength. And then there was the direct interventions from the United States, you know, not all of them being very helpful, but, you know, criticisms that were made of human rights violations by China, Russia, you know, other countries that upheld, I think, a liberal international order. And, you know, essentially the United States was missing in action for 4 years on that front, and in fact seemed to be giving comfort to these strongman leaders like Xi Jinping or Kim Jong-un and so forth. And obviously India was one of them. India was one of the few countries where Donald Trump was actually quite popular. And so I'm sure that that bolstered Prime Minister Modi's popularity as well. But I just think that, you know, external parties and even a big one, important one like the United States are relatively minor players in the drama that is unfolding in India. The COVID epidemic is going to have an effect. You know, 3 months ago, Modi was congratulating himself for having defeated the virus, and now you're in the midst of a health crisis that is setting a lot of world records. I mean, you know, people seem to think that the official statistics on the death toll dramatically understates, you know, the actual damage that's being done to the health of Indian citizens, and what impact that will have on the future of the BJP in India, I think is going to be much more important than you know, anything that President Biden does or says.
Thank you, Professor. So the second part of Sneha's question is related to how Modi was elected. She says, Modi's election was coined as the WhatsApp election. What are your insights on the rise of propagandistic sources circulating information, and how can these powerful media channels be replaced systematically by data-driven sources with the goal of generating a more aware and conscious population?
Well, yeah, that's the issue I was trying to address, you know, when I was talking about content moderation. I think that one of the big problems is that these platforms have seen it in their self-interest to promote bad information, because that's how they earn revenues. That's how they earn advertising revenues. And there are some relatively easy things that they could do to change that. So in the case of WhatsApp, I believe that they've already put limits on the number of people that could be in a single WhatsApp group, but those limits could be made, you know, much stricter, so as to prevent that platform from being used as a source of, you know, really broad populist mobilization. I think that the content moderation of political speech, as I said, is a lot more problematic, because I don't think the platforms really have either the legitimacy or the capacity to really make these very delicate political decisions as to what is acceptable speech and what not. And I don't think that the measures, you know, like Facebook has created this review panel to review the content moderation decisions that it's made. And, you know, that's not a long-term solution either, because the whole issue is, you know, what gives any of these groups you know, broad democratic legitimacy. I think that's why we have government institutions that are democratically legitimated, and they're the ones ultimately that have to make these decisions. But, you know, they're very difficult in a country like the United States, where there's such a degree of polarization that you couldn't possibly have a kind of consensus view emerge as to what's acceptable speech and what is not, and therefore that regulatory path is foreclosed. That's part of the reason we ended up with our middleware solution, because it tries to hand off the problem to a more competitive part of the market rather than having it dominated by large platforms. One thing I would just say is that there are, you know, a substantial number of activists who are pursuing a worthwhile goal, which is to limit hate speech and conspiracy theories. But they actually want to go beyond that to try to pressure the platforms to basically ban this stuff, this kind of content altogether. And I think that if you actually believe in freedom of speech, that's not the right attitude to take. That, you know, if you believe in free speech, you know, people have the right to say things that are false. They have the right, and they have the right to say things that are not very pleasant, you know, to hear. There are very few limits really that we place on that, and just replacing a government actor as the as the enforcer with a private actor, I don't think changes any of that. So the objective should not be to get the platforms to ban this kind of content. I think the objective should really be to prevent the platforms from artificially either amplifying or silencing the voices that are out there, because I think we have to just confront, frankly, the fact that we live in very diverse societies where a lot of people believe a lot of things that other people find very, offensive or wrong. But that's something that's in the society and not something that I think can be solved by, by a big internet platform.
Thank you, Professor. Yeah, I agree. I think that the struggle is to find that balance between not limiting the freedom of speech and also finding a way to address those issues that come from this echo chamber that sometimes get blown off. So moving forward, another student here, Liv, asks a completely different question, something that probably you have seen coming because it happened to you already. But she says she recently read an interview you delivered, and you said that the end of history, probably your most famous work, that the word the end of history, you knew that they would be misunderstood. And she's asking, how do you cope with your work being misunderstood?
Well, I guess the way I've coped with it is having to repeat over and over again, the answer to that same question. From the moment my original essay was published with the title "The End of History" with a question mark at the end, back in the summer of 1989, people had misinterpreted it and immediately said, well, what about this? What about that? Doesn't it show that you're completely wrong? Usually referring to some event that happened in the world that would qualify as history. In part, I think that represents a kind of lack of understanding of the background of the term. It's not something that I invented. That phrase was really used by the philosopher Hegel originally, and then it was picked up from Hegel and used by Karl Marx, both of whom argued that there would be an end of history, meaning a terminal point for the development of human societies and institutions. And Hegel believed that it would be a liberal solution, and Marx believed that it would be communism, right? And so the argument that I made way back in that original article was that it didn't look like we were going to get to communism as the end of history. It looked like if there was an end of history, it was going to be something much more like what the Marxists called bourgeois democracy. And curiously, over the years, the people that didn't have this misunderstanding of what I was saying were actually people that were educated in a Marxist tradition, because they understood perfectly well, what the end of history meant. They just thought I was wrong about where history would end, but they understood the underlying meaning. And for that reason, I think it still remains an open question. Is the highest form of human social development something like a liberal democracy that promises some balance between freedom and equality on a universal basis? Or is there another form of socio-political organization that is higher than that represents a systematically better form of organization? And, the thing that I've said right from the beginning is that the only country that looks like it offers a realistic alternative is China, because they have an overtly authoritarian form of government. But unlike many authoritarian governments, they're also extremely capable with regard to producing a high-tech, modern economy. And if that proves to be durable and stable, and if China continues to grow in the way that it has, then I would say, yeah, there is a real alternative. I'm a little skeptical how many countries can adopt a Chinese model, but it's turning out that it's pretty hard to adopt a Western liberal democratic model as well. And so right from the beginning have entertained the idea that there are alternatives, and that question mark that was at the end of my title was still there. And that's where I am right now.
Someone forgot the question mark, Professor.
Right.
So talking about China, another student, Laura Rong, asking, will U.S.-China relations continue to decline? Will China and Russia unite to counter liberal influence?
Well, I'm afraid that that the relationship with China is going to deteriorate over time, as it has. That's actually one point of big continuity between Obama and Trump, that many parts of the Trump agenda, not the anti-Chinese rhetoric, but the substantive policies have actually been continued by the Biden administration. In my view, this is really China's fault. It really has to do with the rise of Xi Jinping as the party general secretary and president in 2013. Back in that period, I think you could say that China had become a kind of, regular, familiar authoritarian regime where its politics was dominated by a communist party, but you had quite a lot of actually individual freedom. I remember being able to travel to China, including going to Nanjing to visit, the SAIS campus there. And getting into discussions with Chinese colleagues, and they could be critical of the government, could say a lot of things about, the nature of, their society that showed that they were not simply towing the party line. And that has progressively become harder and harder to do, because I think that Xi Jinping has decided that that authoritarian model was not adequate, that he wanted, he's a very strange person in many ways, because he and his family were sent down during the Cultural Revolution, and they suffered personally from it. Most of the people that went through that, his contemporaries, came out of the Cultural Revolution saying, never again, are we going to allow this kind of cult of personality to dominate our politics. And that's the reason why you had collective leadership, you had term limits, you had various kinds of constraints on the power of the senior leadership in China from the days of Deng Xiaoping up until the moment that Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao stepped down. But Xi Jinping has reversed all of that. He's abolished the term limits. He's abolished many of these institutional constraints on his own power, and tried to enforce a much higher degree of party control. So every Chinese university faculty now, every department's got a party commissar that sits in the department meetings to make sure that nobody's saying the wrong thing. And that's really a big change. And in foreign policy, I'm afraid that we are heading for, a really big crisis. And in fact, I think that that's probably the single biggest challenge that Biden is going to face in the near future. 2 years ago, a little more than 2 years ago, Xi Jinping gave a speech in which he said that Taiwan would come back and be reincorporated into China within a decade. And that means that there's 8 more years before that, promise needs to be kept. And he said that that would happen either peacefully or, if necessary, by force. And I think that, that's going to be the biggest challenge that American foreign policy is going to face if China actually ramps up its military pressure against China. There's a lot of different scenarios by which this could happen. But, the fundamental question that American foreign policy is going to face is how are we going to support Taiwan? Militarily, the balance in the Taiwan Strait has changed dramatically over the last few years. and China's ability to, to do what it wants is much, much greater than it had been. And politically, I think this is a big challenge regardless of what party is in power, because I don't think that there is anything like a consensus that in the United States that Americans are willing to send their sons and daughters to die on behalf of Taiwan. And I think that that is that's an issue that is going to come back and strike us, very powerfully in the near future. On the question of collaboration, yes, there is collaboration. During this recent Russian military buildup on Ukraine's borders, I pay a lot of attention to Ukraine. I've been there quite a few times, and we have a number of leadership programs there, so I'm quite familiar with that country. And all of my former the alums of our programs there, some of them were actually getting ready to evacuate Kiev because they thought that Putin might get serious about actually trying to attack at least Donbass, if not the whole of Ukraine. And one nightmare scenario that's occurred to me in the last couple of weeks is, what if China and Russia, coordinate and they both make military moves on Ukraine and Taiwan simultaneously? The United States would be hard pressed to meet either of these challenges on its own, but if they were combined and somehow coordinated, that would be, a very serious crisis, and it would, in a way, underline, in a way, the hollowness of some of our current commitments to defend, friends and allies. So, I don't know. We can spend the next week talking about, how you adjust policy to meet that, but I do think that that's probably one of the biggest vulnerabilities in Biden's agenda right now.
Yeah, Professor, it is true. This is a difficult situation for the liberal old order in general, and clearly the helm of it, so the United States. So moving on, I have a question from a fellow SGA member, Connor O'Brien. He is asking you, what does the mainstreaming of certain far-right populist conspiracy theories and narratives, such as Trump actually won the election or COVID being fake or QAnon, mean for academic discourse between those of differing views?
Well, obviously, it's not good if you have to argue with somebody over whether, Democrats are blood-sucking cannibals that like to eat children in tunnels under Washington. I'm not sure that you can have much of a rational discussion with that. And it's actually interesting, there've been a lot of pieces that have come out lately about people that had family members that got sucked into QAnon fantasies, and how difficult it is to deal with someone like that. I think in general that it requires a different mode of analysis, where the real issue is more psychological than policy oriented or political. I mean, our traditional mode about thinking about political differences is really been based on policy. Republicans like lower taxes, Democrats want a bigger welfare state, and who supports which policy and for what reasons. And that's kind of the realm of normal political life. But you're now talking about a substantial group of people that believe something that is fundamentally false. And I think you can speak psychologically about why that's the case, in terms of things like motivated reasoning. But it's so far off of any kind of realm of discussion that pretends to be rational, that I'm really not sure that it's subject to much kind of reasonable discourse. I think I'm actually in the process of writing a book that's a defense of classical liberalism, and I have a chapter in it that gets into the question of how we got to this point that we're at, where the basic kind of rational method that was closely associated with liberalism. That is to say, the scientific method, dependence on empirical verification, and the like, that's taught in every, beginning statistics course anywhere in the world today, how that came to be questioned. And actually, it came first to be questioned on the left because in the writings of Michel Foucault, for example, he argued that modern natural science is not a neutral, objective approach to knowledge. It actually reflects underlying power structures, and many of the conclusions that appear to be, scientific and objective actually are biased. And there's a lot of examples that you can give. His have to do with, homosexuality, incarceration, mental illness. All of these things, I think actually did reflect, norms that were prevalent at a particular age and not simply any kind of, scientific observation. However, that laid the ground for a broader attack on the scientific method as a mode of cognition that then gets expanded to, to challenge, the possibility of objectivity more broadly. And, this appears in many of the critical theory critiques of, a lot of existing academic discourse. And I think what's happened is that that kind of thinking has simply migrated over to the right, where people on the right say, well, we are a victimized and misunderstood group as well, that are under attack by elites that have a certain way of looking at the world. You see this in the rhetoric about the COVID epidemic, where we don't believe Anthony Fauci because he claims to be a scientist, but he's actually promoting, a political agenda that is really what's driving it. And this is a kind of elite conspiracy that is motivating him. So, don't believe him just because he's got a lab coat on. And this is it's a big problem that's come to infect, a large part of what's turning out to be an increasingly illiberal set of actors in a modern democracy.
So following through what we are talking about, I find very interesting a question that was posed by Claudia Flisi, who is a SAIS alumna and a journalist. And she asks, with the rise of technology in international political panorama, how should the training of political scientists change to keep pace? What should SAIS and other School of International Affairs, Columbia, Taft, do to ensure that future thinkers are adequately prepared for it?
Well, I think that a lot of schools are actually wrestling with this problem right now. Here at Stanford, I think we've done this because we are right in the middle of Silicon Valley, and so it's a little bit hard to get away from this technology issue. But in my institute, we established a cyber policy center a couple of years ago, and so I currently run a little MA program that's very much like SAIS. It's a 2-year master's in international policy, much smaller. We only take about 25 students a year, but we do offer a cyber policy specialization because there are a lot of people that want to learn about security issues, about content moderation, about the relationship of digital technology to democracy, to geopolitics, and the like. And I think that that's probably a change that will have to take place in many schools. I think for a long time, people thought that technology was not an independent variable, that, it was simply following society and reflecting existing trends in society. So if a country was polarized, it was, the polarization was due to sociological or political factors, but not being driven by technology. And I think, today you would probably say that that's questionable. Not that technology is driving all polarization, but I think the causality, goes both ways. And there have been a lot of empirical studies that have tried to, demonstrate the degree to which that's true. And if it's the case that technology by itself becomes an independent variable that will affect real world outcomes, then we're going to have to incorporate that into our curricula, and that is going to require a baseline of knowledge about the underlying technology itself, and that's a pretty tall order because that changes very, very rapidly. But I think this is going to happen inevitably in basically certainly in all policy schools.
Thank you, Professor. I tend to agree with you. There should be a natural and organic adaptation to the changing environment, I believe, if we want to survive. So moving on, something we didn't cover much, but it is interesting. It's the macro idea of the European Union and Europe in general. So a good friend of mine and another SAI student, Giorgio, would like to ask you a question about the European Union. So he says, many saw the EU Recovery Fund as a step toward a fiscal union and as an Hamiltonian moment. Macron and Merkel repeatedly talked about the strategic autonomy. However, soon there will be election both in France and Germany. Do you believe Trump presidency COVID trigger EU federalization? Tricky question, but interesting, nevertheless.
So it's not going to happen quickly, but I do think that COVID underlined to a lot of people that there was this need for greater centralized authority in certain areas. So this has been my view of the EU for a long time, is that it's too centralized in the wrong areas and doesn't have enough centralization in other areas, right? So the areas where it really exerts a lot of centralized power is in the kind of micro regulation of economic life, where the Commission really sets, labeling standards and product safety and all sorts of, different rules. And in fact, that's what gets a lot of people very annoyed with the EU, because they've got this local cheese that, they've been producing for hundreds of years, and Brussels tells them, no, you can't do that. But on the other hand, there are huge areas, beginning with fiscal policy, where you really do need a more centralized form of decision making, so that outcomes can be equalized across the EU. And I think that's what drove this this fund that was triggered by COVID. And in that respect, I do think that what happened is still an important precedent, right? Because throughout the whole Euro crisis in 2010 to 12, the Germans were absolutely opposed to anything like, a common floating of Euro bonds that, would break their own austerity rules and allow them to more directly support other parts of the EU. And that, that precedent has now been broken, and I don't think anyone's going to restore it. But obviously, there are still big disagreements on, how that money is going to be implemented. I think that the way that the EU approached, the vaccine procurement was a disaster. I think everybody acknowledges that now. That is something that probably should not have been centralized in the interest of speed and kind of efficient delivery. So I think that, there's a lot of sorting out that needs to be done in the wake of what's happened over the past year. And, it means that I think that progress towards a truly federal, meaning a more centralized Europe, is critical. I guess the final thing to say is in foreign policy, where Europe remains a real weakling because essentially it requires consensus in its decision making on foreign policy matters, and that's been, I think, very harmful. For example, in Eastern Europe with the Chinese initiatives like this 17+1. In fact, on my blog today, I've got a little piece on this highway in Montenegro that the Chinese funded, and Montenegro got into a lot of trouble and now has appealed to the EU to get it bailed out. And I think that, there you've got this really bad situation where every member of the EU, all 27 members, can veto any decision. And so that's why, EU as a whole has been silent on the Uyghurs, on, human rights in China, on a whole range of issues. And that's an area where I think that, greater unity is really necessary. So that's one where I hope there will be, some correction and some, way of getting past this incredible fragmentation that has allowed outside powers really to, I think, exploit the EU.
Yeah, the future of the EU, a very interesting chapter. Trying to go back instead to global dynamics and technology, Massimiliano Dore asked you a question. He says, do we need to head toward multipolar global governance that will have to be in charge of regulate big tech platforms? Is that the solution? Also, do you think that the social media changed the concept of identity worldwide?
I see it being very difficult to have a truly global regulation of technology just because the underlying interests are too disparate, right? So China regulates its internet sector very heavily, and it does it with a clear authoritarian intent. So the way they've treated Jack Ma and Alibaba, is really trying to show that they're the boss, that it's the Communist Party that's the boss. And that's not something any democratic country is going to want to do. And in fact, I think that in the area of technology regulation, there's probably a different kind of international cooperation that's necessary. And that, unfortunately is going to harken back to the Cold War, where I do think that democratic countries really have to get on the same page with regard to resisting China's effort to spread its own undemocratic norms and practices around the world. To me, I just think it's completely crazy for any serious liberal democracy to allow Huawei to build its basic, telecom infrastructure. It's completely crazy. There's no way that doesn't hand China, tremendous power, in the future. And that's an area where I think, democracies really have a lot of common interests where there ought to be a lot of coordination in the way that they approach that. But because there hasn't been that level of cooperation, China has been able to appeal to, particular countries who definitely need the infrastructure, don't want to pay the costs of, alternatives, and so forth. So that kind of cooperation I do see as important. And you've already seen, a shift in that direction. And there, I think actually Biden will do a lot better because, Trump was so, I don't know how to describe it, but, he would take this strong anti-Chinese posture at the same time that he was attacking all of his democratic allies, South Korea and Germany and so forth, on trade issues. And that's not the way you build a coalition. You've got to set priorities. And in that respect, I think, Biden is likely to do a lot better in getting people to sign up for this agenda.
I completely agree with you, Professor. So we are moving into our last 10 minutes of conversation, and we are really glad for all your answers. So let me ask you the last question, and then we can have some concluding remarks. Yisu asks you, do you think that the conflict between US and China is more ideological or more because China has threatened the US leadership in the world?
Well, it's both. I think that, as I was saying, because Xi has been interested in moving in a more totalitarian direction and a more ideological direction himself, and has also been willing to try to project that Chinese model outwards, which earlier generations of Chinese leaders didn't have a particular interest in doing. There's definitely an ideological component to this. You know, in a democracy, we have certain underlying values regarding human rights and a liberal order, and you know that's directly challenged by a lot of Chinese policies and practices. But it's also the case that, and this is where I think traditional IR theory has something to say, that there's also just a power issue going on here, that as a country becomes more powerful in a global setting, its ambitions expand. So in previous decades, China regarded itself as weak and it wasn't going to set an agenda for world politics. But now that it's second to the United States, or even more powerful in certain respects than the United States, it is going to set that agenda. The Chinese have been inserting their people into international organizations across the board, in standard setting, air traffic control, disease prevention, phytosanitary rules, and so forth. And I think that they're not going to be content with being rule takers. They're going to want to be able to make the rules increasingly. And that's something that will happen regardless of ideology. When the United States was the dominant power, it set the rules in a lot of these areas. And now that there's another big power out there, the ability to set rules is going to shift. So, both of those things I think are operating simultaneously.
Thank you, Professor. If you bear with me, I received another question for Professor Helwood that I didn't see previously. So I will ask you that, and then we will have our concluding remarks. Professor Helwood says that populists are the worst at managing COVID, and is bringing the case of Italy in the regions of Piedmont and Veneto. But his question is another. He said, I've been following identity politics since the 1990s, and I've come to the conclusion that populism is really militant provincialism, defensive, protectionist, anti-cosmopolitan, and so on. And he brings the examples we all know: Trump, Brexit, the Lega here in Italy, and so on. What do you think?
Well, that's certainly the case for right-wing identity politics. The question is whether that has any relation. When we speak of identity politics, we actually, in the United States, tend to think not of, in the first instance, of Trump and the alt-right. We tend to think of, identity based on gender, sexual orientation, race, ethnicity, and so forth. And one of the big questions facing the left-wing version of identity politics is whether their goal is simply to use identity mobilization as a way to integrate into a liberal order that is based on a belief in a certain kind of human universalism, or are they actually arguing in favor of separate group identities that become the kind of units of politics? And they're advocates of both of those visions of identity at the same time. And, it's my view that ultimately, if you choose the second version of progressive identity, where you say, essentially these groups based on race, gender, ethnicity, and so forth are incommensurate and, kind of self-contained units, then I think they join hands with the right-wing identitarians that, believe in nation or religion or some other, marker as the fundamental thing that defines, what they want. And so that's the respect in which I think, there's a real tension in the way that identity is understood in progressive circles. And, I support the one that has a liberal, ultimately liberal, vision of where this is going, and not the latter.
Thank you, Professor. So to conclude our conversation, I'd like to ask you a question. You have placed yourself among some of the greatest thinkers of history. You talk about Hegel, you bring Marx into it. And you mentioned during our conversation that you're writing something about classic liberalism. And I believe that to be a classic liberal, you need to have a positive note. You need to have a positive take. John Locke and those thinkers who believe that humans are not that bad after all. Do you share the sentiment? Do you think that in the politics of today, we need a positive approach to it?
Yeah, so definitely. This is something I argue in my book, that, there's one way of regarding liberalism as a means of governing over diversity, because it was really intended to prevent people from killing each other over religion, and then over nation. That was really the foundation of the European Union. But it turns out that that's not enough, because, when you go through a period of peace and prosperity, people begin to take peace and prosperity for granted, and they start to want other things. But I do think that there is a vision of what a liberal society can produce that's captured. I quoted Pericles' funeral oration, that was related by Thucydides, in that where he says, what's great about Athens is that we are the home of innovation, of open thinking, of open discussion, and as a result, we become very rich and powerful because we are open to other ideas. And I do think that liberal societies have to recognize that some of the most successful and progressive societies in the world in human history have been liberal societies, precisely because they don't try to govern the way that people think fundamentally. So I do think that that's part of a kind of forward-looking liberal agenda.
Professor, I think it is time to close our conversation. Thank you for closing in that positive note, I would say. Thank you a lot for joining us. It has been a real honor to host you today, even if virtually. We hope to see you back here in Bologna as soon as possible. We know that you are a friend of this school and of this city and of our food. I am from Emilia-Romagna, so for me it's particularly important. I'm very proud of it. So, Professor, again, thank you very much. It was an honor. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for having me.
Have a great rest of your day. Bye.
Yep, bye.